Section 1. Where it all began. The secrets hidden in the show's very origins. There is something almost impossibly comforting about settling in with a show you have watched 100 times, something you know the way you know your own living room, and then realizing, very quietly, that you never really saw it at all, that the walls were painted with things you just walked past without stopping, that the carpet had a pattern you never traced, that the whole house had rooms you somehow never entered, even though you visited it practically every week for 25 years. Family Guy is that house. Most people think they know Family Guy. They know Peter Griffin and his round belly and the way his eyes go half closed when he is about to do something catastrophically stupid. They know Stewie's high chair and his arsenal of weapons, and that voice, plummy and crisp and somehow completely wrong for the body it lives in. They know Brian's martini glass and the drunken clam, and the way Cleveland will announce his own exit from a second-story bathtub with the kind of resigned calm that suggests he has been through worse. They know the cutaway gags and the musical numbers and the way the show has a particular rhythm to it, a heartbeat that is completely its own, unmistakable even when you can't quite hear the words. But knowing the surface of Family Guy and knowing what lives inside it are two entirely different things. The show that Seth MacFarlane built is layered in a way that most people never fully appreciated during the act of watching it. Hidden beneath the cutaways and the one-liners and the borderline offensive jokes was a parallel text, a second show running alongside the first, speaking in a quieter voice to anyone who happened to pause at the right moment, or catch a background detail in their peripheral vision, or notice that a prop on a shelf said something that had absolutely nothing to do with the plot, but everything to do with how the writers felt about what they were making. Tonight, we are going to slow all of that down. We are going to walk through the halls of this show as if we have never been inside before, and we are going to look at what was always there, hiding in plain sight. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the light go low if you want it to. We are going to start at the very beginning because the secrets start there too. Before Family Guy was Family Guy, before it was even a pitch or a concept or a conversation in a Fox executive's office, it was a thesis film made by a 21-year-old kid at the Rhode Island School of Design. Seth MacFarlane had grown up drawing cartoons in his bedroom in Kent, Connecticut, and by the time he arrived at RISD, he already had the sensibility fully formed in his mind. He just needed the right container for it. That thesis film, completed in 1995, was called The Life of Larry. It ran about 11 minutes and featured a middle-aged slob named Larry Cummings, his patient wife Lois, his overweight teenage son Milt, and Larry's cynical talking dog named Steve. If those names and descriptions feel familiar to you, they should. Larry Cummings would become Peter Griffin. Steve would become Brian Griffin. The patient wife named Lois stayed named Lois. Even the film's structure, with its cutaway gags and its cheerful willingness to be offensive, was already pointing toward the show that would eventually air on national television. But here is the part of the origin story that most people skip over. MacFarlane also included Newt Gingrich in The Life of Larry. Not as an animation, but as actual archival audio. He dropped in a clip of a Gingrich speech as a cutaway gag. That impulse, to reach out and grab something from the real world and drop it into the cartoon as a commentary on what was happening around him, would go on to define the entire creative DNA of Family Guy for more than 2 decades. The show was always going to be politically engaged. It was always going to pull from the news. That was baked in before the show had a name. MacFarlane's professor at RISD liked the film enough to send it to Hanna-Barbera Productions. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. A college student made a short film for a class assignment, and that film traveled on its own, without the student doing anything else, directly into the hands of one of the most storied animation studios in history. Hanna-Barbera hired him in 1995, and MacFarlane moved to Los Angeles to begin working on shows like Dexter's Laboratory and Johnny Bravo. He spent a couple of years writing for those shows and learning the rhythms of professional animation production, and then, in 1996, he returned to his Larry and Steve characters and made a sequel short, simply titled Larry and Steve. This one was different. It was sharper. The relationship between the dim, well-meaning slob and his hyper-intelligent dog had been refined through a year of professional experience, and what emerged on screen was much closer to what Peter and Brian would eventually become. This short made it onto Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons anthology in 1997, and people noticed. Fox noticed most of all. Executives at Fox reached out to MacFarlane and offered him a deal to create a television series. The offer did not come without conditions, though. Fox initially approached him to work on Mad TV, their sketch comedy show. MacFarlane declined. He had bigger plans, and he knew exactly what show he wanted to make. He counterpitched a concept based on his Larry and Steve characters, and Fox agreed to let him develop it. And this is where one of the show's most delightful hidden secrets comes in. Before Family Guy existed, Seth MacFarlane developed a completely different show for Fox called Gumball 2 Gumball. It was a beach-based sports news show, and it was rejected before it ever made it anywhere near a screen. MacFarlane was apparently philosophical about this, and he eventually paid tribute to his own failure in a very MacFarlane way. He hid the name of his rejected show inside Family Guy itself, placing it as a background detail in an episode so that anyone paying close enough attention would catch it as a quiet, self-deprecating wink. The rejected pitch became a secret message, folded into the show that succeeded where the earlier idea had not. It is the kind of gesture that tells you something important about the creative culture that built this program. These writers were aware of the show's history. They were aware of their own history within it, and they left traces of themselves in every corner they could. Now, MacFarlane spent 6 months in 1997 essentially not sleeping, drawing the Family Guy pilot in his kitchen. He described this period as one of almost complete social isolation, just him and the animation table and the growing stack of character designs and storyboards. He did all of this on a very limited budget. Fox had given him a deal, but deals come with financial constraints, and MacFarlane was working with less than most people would consider workable. The 7-minute pilot he produced was enough. Fox greenlit the series and ordered a full season. MacFarlane was 24 years old when he got that call. He would go on to voice Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire simultaneously, a feat of vocal range that remains one of the more quietly astonishing achievements in the history of American animation. The first episode of Family Guy, titled Death Has a Shadow, aired on the 31st of January 1999, directly following Super Bowl 33. 22 million people watched it. By any measure, that is a staggering number for a debut, and the post-Super Bowl slot deserves some credit for it. But the show held on to enough of those viewers in subsequent weeks to establish itself as a genuine presence in the Fox lineup. It was sharp and weird and confident in a way that felt new, even if you could trace its influences back through The Simpsons and Married with Children, and even farther back than that. And from that very first episode, the hidden details were already there. Most viewers watching Death Has a Shadow were paying attention to Peter losing his job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory, or to Stewie's cheerful cruelty toward his own mother, or to the Kool-Aid Man smashing through a courtroom wall. They were not pausing on background props or squinting at text on signs in the corner of the frame, but if they had been, they would have found that the creators had put things there specifically for people who would pause. The impulse to hide messages for the attentive viewer was sewn into the show's fabric from day one, and it only got more elaborate from there. This is the thing about Family Guy that makes rewatching it such a different experience from watching it the first time. The show was designed for 2 audiences simultaneously. There was the audience watching it on the couch with a beer, following the plot and laughing at the cutaways. And there was the other audience, the one with a remote control in hand and a finger hovering over the pause button, the one who wanted to know what the books on Peter's shelf were actually titled, or what the sign in the background of the school hallway actually said. The writers fed both audiences, all the time, in every episode. And tonight we are going to sit with the second audience's experience. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are in the world right now and what time it is there. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time to do that. It keeps the lights on and helps more people find their way here. Section 2. The Hidden DNA of Stewie Griffin. Of all the characters in Family Guy, no one carried more secret freight than Stewie Griffin. On the surface, Stewie was a joke. A very good joke, executed with extraordinary precision, but a joke nonetheless. The premise was so simple and so absurd that you could describe it in a single sentence. There is a baby in a yellow shirt who wants to kill his mother and take over the world, and everyone around him is too distracted to notice. That was it. That was the whole thing. And it was enough to make him the most iconic character on the show for the first several seasons, the one people quoted and imitated and put on their t-shirts. But Stewie's story, the real story, the one running underneath the surface, was considerably stranger and considerably richer than the basic premise suggested. Start with his very first scene in the very first episode. The Griffin family is seated around the kitchen table for breakfast, and in the background, Mostly ignored by everyone else at the table, Stewie is tinkering with something. He turns a final screw, straightens up, and says with great satisfaction, "Excellent." The mind control device is nearing completion. His mother, Lois, mistakes it for a toy and confiscates it. Stewie responds, "Darn you, vile woman! You've impeded my work since the day I escaped your wretched womb." Those were his first words on television. Not a baby noise, not a gurgle. A declaration of scientific intent, followed by a grievance against his own mother for being born. The show was telling you exactly who this character was in his very first appearance. And most people laughed and moved on and didn't stop to think about what it meant that a children's television trope, the adorable baby, had been weaponized into a supervillain with access to advanced technology. The hidden layers of Stewie's character built from there, episode by episode, in ways that rewarded careful attention. In the second episode of the first season, I Never Met the Dead Man, Stewie attempts to launch a missile from a device he has constructed and hidden inside what looks like a simple baby toy. The toy is sitting on a shelf in his bedroom. It is visible for exactly 2 seconds before the scene moves on. If you are watching at normal speed, you register it as background clutter and forget it immediately. If you pause on it, what you see is an extraordinarily detailed technical apparatus disguised as a plastic infant's plaything, with what appears to be a guidance system drawn in miniature on its surface. The writers were doing something deliberate with this level of detail. They were committing to the reality of Stewie's world even in the frames where he was not the focus. His bedroom was not just a room. It was a laboratory. A secret laboratory with good lighting and a twin bed and a mobile hanging over it that happened to double as an early warning radar system. The production design team worked hard on Stewie's space throughout the early seasons, filling it with background equipment that was never explicitly called out in dialogue, but was always there for the people looking. There were blueprints on his wall. There were technical diagrams tucked under his mattress. There were components in various states of assembly on his desk. Things that could be anything at first glance and were very specifically something when you got close to them. And then there was the redrum moment. In the Season 2 episode Love Thy Trophy, the Griffin family gets caught up in a scheme involving their neighbors and a trophy they have won at a cooking contest. It is a typically absurd episode, and Stewie's involvement is relatively peripheral. He has a few lines, a few moments of menace, and then a scene where he is sitting on the floor playing with his alphabet blocks. If you watch this scene at normal speed, you see a baby playing with blocks. If you pause on it, what you see is that Stewie has carefully arranged the blocks to spell out red rum. This is, of course, the word that Danny Torrance writes in blood on the walls of the Overlook Hotel in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, the reverse spelling of murder that signals the full arrival of the hotel's malevolent supernatural influence into the child's consciousness. Kubrick's film had been out for decades when this episode aired. It was already a cornerstone of horror cinema, already the kind of reference that would read instantly to anyone who had seen it. The joke layered meaning on meaning. Stewie is a baby, the age of a child from a horror film, sitting peacefully with his building blocks, playing a completely innocent game. And the word he has assembled with those innocent blocks is the harbinger of murder, written backwards, visible only to someone who stopped the playback and looked closely enough to read it. The show was not just making a reference. It was saying something about who Stewie was beneath the cheerful exterior. It was making a connection between the evil genius baby in the yellow shirt and the corrupted child in the haunted hotel. Both were children. Both were under the influence of something dark that the adults around them could not or would not perceive. And both were communicating that darkness through methods available to their age, blocks and building toys, and scrawled messages in hallways. But there was more underneath Stewie than just the villain persona. The show planted hints of a deeper complexity in him very early on, hints that most viewers read as throwaway jokes, but that accumulated, over time, into a portrait of a character with an entirely secret inner life. Consider the question of who could understand Stewie and who could not. In the early seasons, the show established a specific and quietly fascinating rule. Most of the characters around Stewie could not understand what he was saying. They heard what adults typically hear from very young children, which is to say, sounds that approximate language without quite reaching it. When Stewie delivered one of his elaborate speeches about world domination or made a sophisticated observation about Lois's parenting failures, the people in the room with him would look blankly in his direction or simply ignore him. Brian was the exception. Brian could understand Stewie perfectly, and this was never explained. The show never sat down to clarify why a dog possessed of human-level intelligence could hear the baby's actual words, when the humans around him could not. It was just a fact of this world, presented without apology or exposition. But here's what makes this interesting when you think about it at length. The rule was never entirely consistent. In certain episodes, other characters appeared to understand Stewie at least partially. In some scenes, Lois seemed to register his words even when the established logic of the show suggested she should not. Various background characters would react to things Stewie said in ways that implied comprehension. This inconsistency was not laziness on the writer's part. At least, not entirely. It was a wobble in the fundamental premise, and the wobble was built in deliberately. The question of whether Stewie could be understood was always going to be unanswerable, because answering it fully would collapse the central joke. The joke required ambiguity. It required the constant uncertainty of whether the people around him were truly oblivious or were, on some level, aware and simply choosing not to engage with the implications of what they were hearing. That uncertainty is its own kind of horror, and the show knew it. The second season began experimenting with a softer side of Stewie very cautiously, almost as if the writers were testing the walls of the container they had built. Quick moments where his menace gave way to something that looked almost like vulnerability. A scene where he expressed anxiety about something unrelated to world domination. A moment where he seemed to want approval from someone. These were small, almost subliminal, and they were easy to dismiss as comedic variation. But they were seeds. The episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang in the first season is one of the earliest places where you can see this seed being planted. The episode's main story involves Stewie building a device to contact the man he calls his father, a being from beyond who gave him his dark mission. There is a whole layer of mythology being established here that the show never fully committed to exploring. A suggestion that Stewie's evil genius personality was not native to him, but had been placed there by some external force. This idea, that Stewie might not be intrinsically evil but might be following instructions from an unseen source, was dropped almost immediately. The show moved on, and the mythology of the cosmic mission faded away. But the episode had put it on the table. It had suggested that beneath the villain persona, there was a child who had been told who to be, rather than discovering it on his own. Decades later, in Season 16, the episode Send in Stewie, Please would pick up this thread again in a remarkably direct way. In that episode, Stewie meets with a child psychologist played by Sir Ian McKellen, and over the course of a long, intimate conversation, he reveals that his British accent is entirely fake. He does not actually have a British accent. The accent, the elaborate vocabulary, the whole performance of the aristocratic supervillain baby is a fabrication. A mask he built for himself and has been wearing so long he almost forgot it was a mask. His real voice, we hear briefly, is something much more ordinary. Something closer to the voices of the children around him at preschool. The moment is played with a kind of quiet devastation. This character, whom the audience has known for 16 seasons, has been performing the entire time. The evil genius was a construction. The British accent was a costume. Stewie Griffin, the icon, the t-shirt, the catchphrase generator, was always an act. And the show had been leaving traces of this for years, scattered in episodes that felt like standalone character studies, but were actually building a continuous psychological portrait of a small person trying very hard to be something he had decided was more interesting than what he actually was. The red rum blocks in Season 2 were not just a movie reference. They were a signal from the writers that there was darkness in this child that went beyond the cheerful supervillainy of the surface performance. The hidden weapon components in his bedroom were not just background gags. They were evidence of a person building elaborate defenses against the outside world. The inconsistency about who could understand him was not just a continuity error. It was a reflection of the character's fundamental ambiguity about whether he wanted to be seen at all. Stewie Griffin is, from the very beginning, a character who is hiding. The evil genius is the disguise. And the show hid that truth the same way Stewie hid his plans, in plain sight, right there on the screen, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Section 3. Freeze frame secrets, background text, and hidden messages. There is a specific kind of pleasure that comes from pausing a piece of media at exactly the right moment and finding something there that was not meant for casual viewing. Something that required effort to see, that rewarded the extra investment of attention. Something the creators put there knowing that most people would never find it. But that would land perfectly for the one person who happened to pause at the right second. Family Guy was one of the great practitioners of this art. The show's writers had a tradition, stretching back to the earliest seasons, of filling backgrounds with readable text that rewarded freeze framing. This was not accidental and it was not incidental. It was a deliberate choice by a creative team that wanted to give the attentive viewer a different show than the one the casual viewer was seeing. The most famous early example of this involves a TV guide. In the Season 2 episode, The Story on Page 1, Peter is trying to come up with a story for Meg to write for her school newspaper, and in his search for inspiration, he picks up a TV guide with Luke Perry on the cover. The magazine is on screen for a very brief moment. At normal viewing speed, it registers as a prop, a detail that grounds the scene in a specific cultural moment. But if you pause on it, the text beneath Luke Perry's picture reads, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air." This is a remarkable thing for a TV show to write in a prop that appears on screen for less than 2 seconds. It is not a joke that functions in the traditional sense. It does not have a setup and a punchline. It is more like a message in a bottle, something dropped into the ocean of the episode on the chance that some future viewer would fish it out and find it meaningful. And it is meaningful. It is a moment of self-awareness that tells you the writers understood exactly what they were doing. They were aware that their show existed in a landscape of other television, aware that there was something slightly improbable about it being on the air at all, given how strange and uncompromising it was, and they were marking that awareness in a format that could only be appreciated by the most dedicated viewers. The people who watch TV guide covers and cartoons with their fingers on the pause button were precisely the people who cared enough about the show to notice. The connection between the message and the prop was perfect. Of course you would see a message about the show being on the air in a TV guide. Where else would you announce that? The show also had a habit of hiding jokes in on-screen text that appeared on props that the characters never explicitly referenced. Books on shelves, signs on walls, documents being carried across the frame, labels on items in the background of kitchen scenes. The writing team would fill these with jokes that had nothing to do with the plot, but that commented on the show itself, on the process of making it, on the relationship between the creators and the audience. One of the best examples of this is the DVD newspaper headline gag. In the Season 4 episode Model Misbehavior, Lois wins a boat race, and the family celebrates by looking at a newspaper that covers their victory. The headline in the broadcast version of this episode reads, "Lower middle class family wins regatta," which is funny enough on its own. But the DVD version of the episode had a different headline tucked beneath the photo, one that was only visible if you paused the disc at the right moment. The hidden headline read, "DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed." The joke is aimed directly at the viewer who has done exactly what the joke describes. You pause the DVD to find the headline joke. You are the millions. You have been identified and gently mocked. The people who made the show were watching you watch the show, and they left a note about what they saw. This kind of self-referential humor runs very deep in Family Guy's DNA. The show was always aware of its own audience in a way that most television programs are not. It knew who was watching, how they were watching, what they were looking for, and it responded to that knowledge not by giving the audience exactly what they expected, but by putting unexpected things precisely where the audience was already looking. Another extraordinary background detail, and one that requires a bit of explanation to fully appreciate, involves what fans have come to call the Holden Caulfield character. In an episode where Peter is playing keyboard and clearly pretending he knows what he is doing, a random man appears in the background and begins berating him for being a fraud, a phony, someone who plays at something without genuine understanding. This man does not have an official name in the show's materials. He is just a background character who wanders through, delivers his grievance, and vanishes. But the writers, either in the writer's room or in later discussions about the episode, named him Holden Caulfield. The reference is to J.D. Salinger's protagonist in The Catcher in the Rye, the most famous literary critic of phoniness in all of American fiction. Holden Caulfield spent an entire novel identifying and condemning phonies with a kind of furious, desperate sincerity. And here he was, transported into a Family Guy episode, doing exactly the same thing, playing the same role he had always played, just with a different setting and a shorter runtime. The joke works on its own. A random guy calling Peter a phony is funny without any literary knowledge. But the named reference elevated it into something else. A nod toward a classic of American literature that the show was gently invoking without ever explicitly naming it. If you got it, you got it. If you did not, the joke still landed just differently. There was also the upside-down wall message. In an episode during the later seasons, a character takes off from a scene, and in the fraction of a second before the camera follows them, there is a message written on the wall behind them. The message is written upside down, and it reads, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." This is a very particular kind of comedy, the kind that requires you to have done something strange in order to experience the payoff. To read the message at normal viewing speed, you would need to either have paused the scene and then physically rotated your screen, or to have been watching your television upside down, which is not a common viewing position. The writers hit a joke that was almost completely inaccessible, and hid it in a show that had already demonstrated a consistent appetite for exactly this kind of almost inaccessible comedy. The background text jokes tended to cluster around specific categories. There were jokes that mocked the viewer for looking. There were jokes that acknowledged the existence of the show as a show. There were jokes that referenced the production process, the writing room, the executives, the network, and there were jokes that existed purely for the pleasure of hiding a joke, with no target or message beyond the act of concealment itself. The Brian's Library background is one of the most frequently cited examples of the production team sneaking content into background details. Brian, the literary dog, had bookshelves visible in various scenes, and those bookshelves contained titles that were not random. Writers and animators took the time to populate them with books that said something about Brian's character, his pretensions, his actual reading level versus his claimed reading level. In early seasons, the shelves contained genuinely serious literary titles alongside self-help books, which told you something about the gap between who Brian wanted to be and who he actually was. In later seasons, as Brian's character shifted, the books on his shelves shifted too. The pretension remained, but the actual quality of the titles changed. The shelves, if you read them carefully across the show's seasons, charted the arc of Brian Griffin's character almost as effectively as any of the explicit storylines. The school hallways also became a canvas for background jokes, signs advertising events that had dark undertones, notices from the principal that contained quietly disturbing information, posters promoting clubs that raised a lot of questions if you thought about them for more than a few seconds. The hallways of James Woods Regional High School were apparently run by people with extremely unusual ideas about what was appropriate to post in an educational environment, and the writers filled them accordingly. One of the cleverest pieces of background text in the show's history involved the newspaper gag from the American Dad opening sequence, which was a running joke in that sister show where each episode's opening featured Stan picking up a newspaper with a different absurd headline. Family Guy eventually made a direct reference to this tradition in one of its own episodes, in a background newspaper that read, "Newspaper gag fails to live up to expectations." This was Family Guy commenting on American Dad's own running joke while simultaneously executing its own version of the joke at half the length and twice the self-awareness. The headline appeared in the background of a scene that had nothing to do with newspapers, and it was visible for less than a second. But for the viewer who had seen both shows and understood the reference, it was a crossover Easter egg more satisfying than most of the explicit crossovers the shows ever attempted. The freeze-frame culture that grew up around Family Guy during the DVD era was, in many ways, exactly what the writers had anticipated and designed for. They knew that DVDs would allow people to stop episodes at any frame they chose. They knew that the internet would create communities of people comparing notes about what they had found. They built accordingly, treating the background of their own show as a secondary publication, a hidden magazine that ran inside the main magazine, available to anyone with the patience to page through slowly enough. Section 4. The Star Wars Secrets, Blue, Harvest, and Beyond. Most Family Guy fans know that the show made a Star Wars parody. A lot of fans know that it made 3 of them. Very few fans know the full depth of what those specials were hiding. The first Star Wars special, which aired in 2007 and was titled Blue Harvest, is on its surface a fairly straightforward retelling of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, with Family Guy characters standing in for the Star Wars cast. Peter is Han Solo, Lois is Princess Leia, Chris is Luke Skywalker, Stewie is Darth Vader, Brian and Cleveland play R2-D2 and C-3PO respectively, and Quagmire ends up as C-3PO in the final version, with the whole affair framed as Peter telling the story to his family during a power outage. The premise is simple, and the execution is affectionate. McFarlane loved Star Wars. This was not a cynical cash-in on a popular property. This was a fan's tribute, elaborate and genuinely knowledgeable about its source material in ways that went well beyond the obvious jokes. The title itself was the first secret. Blue Harvest, the name given to the special, sounds like it could be a made-up nonsense title, the kind of thing you might generate by combining two unrelated words. But it was not made up. Blue Harvest was the actual working title used during the production of Star Wars Episode VI, Return of the Jedi, deployed specifically to prevent leaks. Here is the story. By the time production began on Return of the Jedi in the early 1980s, the Star Wars franchise had become a cultural phenomenon of a scale that made location shooting almost impossible to conduct in secret. Reporters and fans and curious onlookers would descend on any location associated with a Star Wars film the moment it became known that production was underway. To counter this, George Lucas and his team created a completely fictitious production. They filed paperwork, created crew uniforms, and told anyone who asked that they were making a low-budget horror film called Blue Harvest, with the tagline, "Horror Beyond Imagination." The deception worked well enough that production proceeded with at least some degree of operational security intact. The name Blue Harvest faded into film history trivia, known primarily to the most dedicated Star Wars enthusiasts and film historians. And Seth MacFarlane, who was exactly the kind of obsessive Star Wars fan who would have known this story, named his special after it. The title choice said, "We have done our research." It said, "This tribute is not superficial." It said, "There is a layer of knowledge here beneath the obvious jokes, and it is there for people who can recognize it." But the title was just the beginning. Inside the special itself, the writing team packed in references that operated on several levels simultaneously. The most famous is the opening crawl sequence. In the original Star Wars films, the opening crawl is a moment of pure mythological sweep, yellow text scrolling into the infinite black of space, establishing the cosmic stakes of the story about to unfold. Family Guy's opening crawl begins in the same spirit and then veers aggressively off-road. It starts with the expected setup, establishing the struggle between the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire. Then, mid-scroll, it reveals that Darth Vader is Luke's father and that Princess Leia is his sister, which are both spoilers for the sequels that the audience has presumably already seen. And then, having dispensed with this narrative courtesy, the crawl pivots to discussing Angelina Jolie's film career, specifically the film Gia, in elaborate and completely irrelevant detail. The joke worked on multiple levels. It was funny because of the violation of form, the solemn opening crawl suddenly becoming tabloid gossip. It was funny because the spoilers were for films the viewer had certainly already seen. And it was also a comment on the opening crawl tradition itself, on the way that these throat-clearing establishing texts had become so familiar that their gravity had been somewhat drained from them by sheer repetition. But there was a third level that required closer attention. The specific choice of Angelina Jolie and Gia was not random. Gia was a biographical film about a supermodel's descent into addiction, which had nothing in common with Star Wars, except that it was a film featuring protagonists with complicated destinies and fraught relationships with power. The joke was deliberately choosing the least relevant comparison possible, the furthest thing from the source material, and inserting it into the most formal and sacred space in Star Wars mythology. The Empire's Star Destroyer in the opening scene of the special had a Bush Cheney 04 campaign bumper sticker visible on its hull for approximately 1 second. This is the kind of detail that you would need to be specifically looking for to catch in real time. At the scale of a Star Destroyer, rendered in animation, a bumper sticker is a tiny thing, but the choice to put it there was a conscious political statement from a creative team that was, in 2007, not particularly fond of the administration then in power. The Star Destroyer, as a symbol of overwhelming military might, wearing a partisan political bumper sticker, was a commentary that most viewers never consciously registered, but that was sitting there in the frame regardless. The cantina scene at the Mos Eisley bar introduced 3 characters who deserve particular attention. Alongside the expected array of alien patrons sitting at tables in the background, the animators slipped in 3 figures from other animated universes. Roger the alien from American Dad was seated at the bar, his characteristic gray body and large dark eyes unmistakable once you knew to look for them. Bender from Futurama was there as well, his metal chassis incongruous among the organic aliens around him. And Coach John McGurk from the short-run animated series Home Movies was present in the corner. The choice of the cantina for this gathering was perfect. In the original film, The Mos Eisley Cantina is explicitly described as a gathering place for criminals, outlaws, and beings of questionable moral character from across the galaxy. Roger from American Dad is a self-confessed sociopath with a history of identity fraud and casual violence. Bender is a career criminal robot whose defining characteristic is an enthusiastic disregard for both laws and other people. Coach John McGuirk is not technically a criminal but is a deeply irresponsible person whose influence on children is consistently catastrophic. These were the right characters for the Cantina. The joke worked because the selection was deliberate. The writers understood the canon they were drawing from and chose their guests accordingly. Then there was the dot matrix moment. The Jawas in Star Wars are collectors of old and discarded droids. When C-3PO and R2-D2 are captured by Jawas on Tatooine, they find themselves among a collection of similarly captured robots. In Family Guy's version of this scene, when the characters disembark from the Sandcrawler, C-3PO thanks what appears to be an early 1990s dot matrix printer for the sex. There are two layers here. The first is the obvious. The Jawas have apparently collected an old dot matrix printer along with their other robot acquisitions, because they are indiscriminate collectors of mechanical objects. The second layer is that dot matrix was also the name of the C-3PO parody character in Mel Brooks's Spaceballs, played by Joan Rivers. The show was not just making a crude joke. It was referencing a prior parody of the very film it was currently parodying, folding the parody tradition in on itself. The second Star Wars special, Something 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 Dark Side, released in 2009, continued this tradition of layered reference and hidden detail. Its title was itself a reference to a specific kind of informal shorthand that people use when they cannot remember the exact title of something, the verbal equivalent of a blank that needs to be filled in. It suggested that even the title of a Star Wars film was too much to hold in memory with precision, which was a joke about cultural saturation masquerading as a title. The third special, It's a Trap, had its own meta-history. During production, multiple alternative working titles circulated, including Episode 6, The Great Muppet Caper, which was a reference to the Ewoks who populate Return of the Jedi, comparing them to the Muppets. The eventual title was a reference to one of the most quoted lines in all of Star Wars, Admiral Akbar's It's a Trap, which had by 2010 become one of the internet's first major memes. What all three specials shared was a quality of affectionate, deep knowledge. The jokes were not the jokes of people who had watched the films once and picked up the obvious reference points. They were the jokes of people who had watched the films dozens of times, who had read about their production histories, who knew the real names behind the cover names and the original titles behind the working titles. The Easter eggs were the evidence of that knowledge, scattered throughout the specials like breadcrumbs from a trail only the well-informed could follow. Section 5. Character crossover cameos and the hidden animated universe. There is a version of the Family Guy universe where all of animated television exists in the same shared space. This is not a theory so much as a documented creative choice, executed repeatedly across many seasons and many episodes by a team of writers who clearly found pleasure in the idea that the shows they made and the shows their contemporaries made all inhabited the same fictional dimension. The cantina scene in Blue Harvest established this most explicitly, but it was not the first instance. Long before that special aired, Family Guy had been quietly threading references to and connections with other animated shows into its episodes, in ways that ranged from the direct to the almost imperceptible. The relationship with Futurama is one of the most interesting. Both shows aired on Fox during overlapping periods. Both shows had a similar creative sensibility in terms of their willingness to reach into science fiction and surrealist territory. Both shows were canceled and then brought back from cancellation, giving them a strange parallel biography. And the shows acknowledged each other's existence with a frequency that spoke to genuine mutual awareness between the creative teams. Bender appeared in the cantina, but there were other, subtler connections. Character designs and backgrounds sometimes contained elements that evoked Futurama's visual language without directly lifting anything. The New York of the far future that Futurama depicted and the alternate dimensions that Family Guy occasionally visited operated under similar rules, suggesting a shared cosmological foundation. The robot-chicken connection was more fraught and more explicitly addressed. In Blue Harvest, when Peter finishes telling the Star Wars story to his family, Chris accuses him of ripping off the Star Wars episode of Robot Chicken. Peter responds by saying he is not a fan of that show. This was a direct reference to a real rivalry, or at minimum a real creative tension, between Seth MacFarlane's work and the work of Seth Green and Matthew Senreich at Robot Chicken, which had produced its own Star Wars parody special in 2007. But here is the hidden layer. Seth Green voices Chris Griffin. In the episode, Chris Griffin accuses Family Guy of ripping off Robot Chicken. Seth Green, the voice of Chris Griffin, co-created Robot Chicken. The character voiced by the co-creator of the competing show accused the show he was currently performing on of stealing from the competing show his real-life self co-created. This is an extraordinarily self-referential nod, and the show tied it so casually that it was easy to miss entirely if you were not aware of the behind-the-scenes context. If you knew Seth Green's resume, the moment was hilarious. If you did not, it was just a throwaway line from a somewhat annoyed teenager. American Dad, MacFarlane's second show, had a relationship with Family Guy that was both competitive and deeply intertwined. The two shows shared the same network, the same Sunday night block for most of their run, and some of the same creative staff. They also shared the same occasional tendency to acknowledge each other's existence in background details and throwaway lines. The American Dad newspaper headline gag, which we discussed in the previous section, was one of the more direct instances of this cross-pollination. But there were subtler ones. Background characters in one show sometimes bore passing resemblance to background characters in the other. Jokes about the broadcast schedule, about which show was getting better ratings, about the comparative quality of the two shows' writing, appeared in both programs with enough frequency to constitute a running dialogue between two creative teams sharing a building. There was also the matter of the evil monkey. The evil monkey who lived in Chris's closet was introduced early in the show's run as one of its most memorable recurring visual gags. Chris would periodically encounter the monkey in his closet, and the monkey would point at him menacingly while Chris screamed, and then the scene would move on. It was never explained. It was just there, appearing with enough regularity to become part of the show's furniture. But in Season 8, the episode Hannah Banana finally gave the evil monkey a backstory. His name, we learn, is something that humanizes him enormously. He used to be a happy monkey living with his wife. He discovered her cheating on him with another monkey, and the heartbreak transformed him. The menacing point became his coping mechanism, his way of expressing feelings that he could not otherwise articulate. He was not evil. He was devastated. This revelation recontextualized every previous appearance of the evil monkey in a way that was quietly devastating. All those years of menacing, pointing, all that apparent hostility directed at Chris, who had done nothing to deserve it. Beneath the horror movie framing and the exaggerated threat, there was just a creature who had been hurt and had not figured out how to move past it. The show had hidden a tragedy inside a recurring sight gag for 7 seasons. The Griffin family's neighborhood, Spooner Street, was itself a canvas for hidden connections and continuity Easter eggs. The neighbors who surrounded the Griffins were not random. They were characters with specific histories and specific relationships to each other that the show developed in background detail over many years. Joe Swanson's trajectory from respected police officer to figure of mockery was documented in slow detail across episodes that, taken individually, each seemed like standalone character moments. But accumulated over many seasons, they told a complete story of a man whose community had gradually stopped seeing him as a person and had started seeing him as a punchline. The show tracked this without ever explicitly announcing it, letting the evidence build across episodes the way real social change builds, gradually, without any single defining moment. Quagmire's history was similarly threaded through in details that accumulated across the seasons. His complicated relationship with women, which became a central and often troubling comedic theme in the show, was seeded early in references to his past that implied depths the show never fully excavated. There were hints at military service, at experiences that had shaped his worldview in ways that went beyond what the broad comedy version of his character could contain. Cleveland Brown, before he eventually got his own spin-off show, was present in the background of many scenes in ways that rewarded attention. His observational humor, his dry response to the chaos around him, was often landing in the background of scenes that were nominally about something else. If you were watching the main action, you missed Cleveland quietly commenting on it from the side. The interconnected universe of Family Guy was always larger than the main cast. The show populated its background with characters who had inner lives, who could be found doing things that made sense for those inner lives even when the camera was not formally pointed at them. This was the kind of world building that takes place through accumulation rather than declaration, building density and texture without stopping the story to explain what it was doing. Section 6. The predictions that came true. There is a genre of online content that is deeply popular and somewhat misleading, and it involves taking jokes from animated shows and presenting them as prophecy. The Simpsons predicted this. Family Guy predicted that. The cartoon knew what was going to happen before the rest of us did. Most of these comparisons are, when examined carefully, the result of confirmation bias. If you make enough jokes about enough topics over enough years, some of them will eventually correspond to real events. This is arithmetic, not clairvoyance. But Family Guy has some cases that are genuinely striking, and examining them carefully reveals not prophecy but something more interesting. A creative team with an unusually sharp read on social reality, capable of following the logical trajectory of emerging situations to conclusions that eventually came to pass. The Kevin Spacey case is the most famous. In 2005, in an episode during the 4th season, Stewie Griffin runs naked through a shopping mall screaming that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. The line is a throwaway, lasting about 2 seconds, designed to be offensive and surreal in the way that Family Guy specialty produced such moments. Kevin Spacey was a major Hollywood star in 2005, an Academy Award winner, one of the most respected dramatic actors of his generation. The joke was the violation of that respectability, a sudden, shocking juxtaposition of a prestigious celebrity with an obviously dark and inappropriate scenario. 12 years later, in 2017, Anthony Rapp came forward with allegations against Spacey. Additional allegations followed. Spacey's career was effectively ended by the revelations that emerged. The Family Guy writers have stated repeatedly and clearly that they had no knowledge of any misconduct on Spacey's part when they wrote the joke. The line was written because it was jarring and boundary violating, which was exactly the kind of comedy the show trafficked in. They were not whistleblowers. They were not delivering a coded message. They were throwing a random name at a random dark scenario and moving on. But the fact that the specific shape of the joke, an escape from captivity, corresponded so closely to the specific shape of the eventual allegations, created something that felt, in retrospect, like more than coincidence. What is actually being demonstrated here is not prediction but observation. The writers were people who absorbed popular culture at an extreme level of intensity, who paid close attention to the signals that celebrities and institutions emitted, and who turned those observations into humor that sometimes pointed in directions that turned out to be accurate. They were not seeing the future. They were seeing the present more clearly than most people did. The Caitlyn Jenner situation is another well-documented case. In a Season 5 episode, Meet the Quagmires, Peter travels back in time to 1984. In this altered timeline, Lois ends up marrying Quagmire instead of Peter, and various consequences cascade from this change. One of the consequences involves Bruce Jenner, the Olympic gold medalist and television personality who was, in 2006 when this episode aired, still publicly presenting as male. The episode depicts Jenner transitioning to female as part of the ripple effects of Peter's time travel. This was a joke that relied on Jenner's status as a masculine icon, the decathlon champion, the embodiment of a certain kind of American athletic masculinity. The punch was the contrast between that image and the scenario the show depicted. In 2015, 9 years after the episode aired, Caitlyn Jenner announced her transition. Again, the show was not predicting anything. It was reaching for the most transgressive version of the premise it could construct, which in the mid-2000s meant gender transgression applied to a figure associated with very traditional masculinity. But the specificity of the target, the fact that the show chose Bruce Jenner rather than some other masculine icon, means that in retrospect it reads as something more. The anti-vaccination episode is arguably the most straightforward of the show's apparent predictions, because it was less about a specific person and more about a social trajectory that the writers correctly identified as likely to accelerate. In 2016, the episode Hot Shots centered on Peter and Lois persuading their neighbors in Quahog to abandon vaccination, leading to a disease outbreak and ultimately a quarantine of the town. The episode was clearly meant as a critique of the anti-vaccination movement, which had been building in prominence for years. The writers were not predicting anything unusual. They were taking an existing trend and extending it to its logical conclusion for comedic and satirical purposes. Then 2020 arrived, and the world became acquainted with quarantine in a way that made the episode feel very different in retrospect. The difference between this case and the Spacey and Jenner situations is instructive. In the first two cases, the show stumbled onto something accurate by making edgy jokes about specific people. In the vaccination case, the show made an accurate prediction by being a sharp social satirist that understood where a trend was heading. The first two were lucky. The third was skilled. The Boston Marathon situation is the most genuinely unsettling. In an episode titled Turban Cowboy, which aired in March 2013, Peter mentions winning the Boston Marathon. A flashback shows him driving a car through the crowd of marathon runners as his method of winning. The same episode featured other plot elements involving terrorism. The episode aired on the 17th of March 2013. On the 15th of April 2013, less than a month later, the Boston Marathon bombing occurred. The episode was immediately pulled from streaming platforms and reruns. The timing was shattering, and no one connected with the show treated it as anything other than a catastrophic coincidence. MacFarlane expressed condolences publicly. The creative team did not comment on the episode itself. What the Boston case demonstrates is the risk that runs alongside the reward of using current events as comedy material. When a joke about a specific, real place and a specific, real event lands too close in time to an actual tragedy at that place, the joke is transformed by context into something no one intended. The writing was on the wall, but the wall turned out to be the wrong wall. The show also apparently foreshadowed its own most painful moment. In the episode Viewer Mail Number 2, a segment features Peter wishing that everyone in Quahog would become Robin Williams. In 2014, Robin Williams died by suicide. The episode, which aired before his death, was subsequently viewed through a lens of tragic hindsight, particularly given that a character on the show, Brian Griffin, was revealed in a Season 8 episode to keep a gun in a safety deposit box because he had considered ending his own life. These resonances, accumulated over 2.5 decades, form a strange portrait of a show that was always paying attention to the world in which it existed, processing that world through humor, and sometimes finding that the humor pointed toward places none of them had intended to go. Section 7. Production Secrets Hidden in Plain Sight. The Family Guy writing room was not a quiet place. It was a room full of people who were deeply invested in the show and who regularly left traces of themselves in the work they were doing. The most common form this took was the cameo, defined loosely enough to include not just character appearances but references to specific people, inside jokes from the production, and moments that required knowledge of who made the show to fully appreciate. Steve Callahan was one of the show's writers and later a showrunner. He also, in an early episode, had his animated likeness appear as a background character at one of Meg's school events. The character is standing in the background with the distinctive physical characteristics that matched Callahan's appearance, identifiable to anyone who knew what he looked like, invisible as anything more than a background figure to anyone who did not. This tradition of hiding writers as background characters stretches across the show's entire run. The people who built the world of the show periodically put themselves into it, not as celebrated cameos but as faces in a crowd. Strangers passing through frames at normal speed, visible only to people who were specifically looking for them or who happened to recognize the reference. Cherry Cheva-Pravat Dumrong is a writer and producer who joined the show in its later seasons. She became notable both for her substantial creative contributions and for her unusually memorable name, which became a running joke within the production. The show eventually acknowledged this directly, placing her name as a visible credit in an episode in a way that called attention to the name itself as an object of humor. The Bonnie Swanson pregnancy is one of the show's most legendary production details, one that falls somewhere between intentional continuity gag and genuine continuity accident. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was established as pregnant in her first appearance. She remained pregnant for a remarkable stretch of the show's run. The exact count varies depending on how you measure it, but she was visibly pregnant for something in the neighborhood of 116 episodes, which is roughly 7 seasons. She was pregnant, in other words, for approximately the same length of time that some children attend elementary school. This extended pregnancy was not, by most accounts, a deliberate storytelling choice. It was a consequence of the show's production process, in which storylines were developed somewhat independently, and the show's continuity was not always rigorously tracked across episodes. But it became famous enough that it transformed from a continuity error into a kind of in-joke, a detail so absurd that it eventually achieved its own status as a celebrated quirk. Bonnie's baby was eventually born in the season 7 episode Baby Not on Board, and the resolution of the 7-year pregnancy was treated with roughly the casualness you might expect from a show that had apparently not decided when the pregnancy would end until it had already been going on for most of a decade. The show's relationship with its own continuity was complicated and deliberate, and it tied directly into one of its hidden production philosophies. Family Guy was not a show that cared very much about internal consistency in the traditional sense. Characters could age or not age. Events could happen and be forgotten. Relationships could reset between episodes. The show operated on a model of emotional continuity rather than factual continuity, meaning that the relationships and personalities remained consistent even when the specific facts surrounding them shifted. This was both a strength and a weakness, and the show knew it. In later seasons, the fourth-wall breaking moments that allowed characters to comment on their own show frequently touched on this inconsistency, characters noting with amusement or exasperation that the rules of their world were not reliably enforced. The pilot within a pilot dynamic was another hidden production detail that required some inside knowledge to fully appreciate. When the show was first developed, MacFarlane created a 7-minute animated pilot to pitch to Fox. This pilot exists separately from the actual first episode that aired. In the actual first episode, Death Has a Shadow, the characters look and sound slightly different from how they would look and sound in later episodes, and some of the rhythms are not quite what they would become once the show found its full voice. But if you find and watch the actual pitch pilot, the differences are even more pronounced. The characters are clearly the same characters, with the same names and the same basic personalities, but they exist in a version of the show that is somewhat rougher, somewhat more tentative, still working out its grammar. Peter looks a little different. The animation style is its own thing. The existence of the pitch pilot is known to fans, and comparing it to the actual show is one of the more illuminating exercises available to anyone interested in the creative process. You can see exactly what MacFarlane was selling to Fox and then see exactly what Fox bought and understand the gap between them. Section 8. Music, Easter eggs, and hidden sound details. Family Guy had a secret life in its music that most people never stop to examine. Seth MacFarlane is, in addition to everything else, a genuinely accomplished singer and musician. He released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards, performed at Carnegie Hall, and demonstrated consistently throughout his career that his musical knowledge was not superficial. He loved music in the specific way that someone loves it when they have spent real time studying it, understanding not just the songs themselves but the traditions and context they came from. This love saturated the show in ways that ranged from the obvious to the nearly hidden. The most famous musical element of Family Guy is also one of its most disguised. The theme song, Family Guy theme or informally Hey Hey, We're the Griffins, is a throwback to the kind of cheerful domestic sitcom theme that characterized television in the 1950s and early 1960s. It sounds innocent and sunny and resolutely middle American. It sounds, in other words, exactly like the opposite of what the show actually is. This was intentional. The theme was chosen to create a specific kind of cognitive dissonance, the gap between the sweet, old-fashioned sound of the music and the decidedly unsweet content that the music was introducing. The theme was a lie told in a major key, and the lie was the point. Every time you heard it, you were being set up for the contradiction that was the show itself. But the theme also contained a hidden musical reference. The chord progression and melodic structure drew from the traditions of American Tin Pan Alley songwriting from the early 20th century, a lineage that MacFarlane clearly cherished. The show was not just sounding retro. It was consciously invoking a specific period of American popular music that MacFarlane believed had been unfairly forgotten, and wrapping it around a show that was, in every other respect, aggressively contemporary. The piano playing that Lois was shown doing throughout the show was consistently given real musical substance. Lois was described as a classically trained pianist, and the music attributed to her in the show reflected genuine knowledge of piano literature. When she sat down to play, what came out of the speakers was not cartoon approximation. It was actual music, played in a style that was appropriate to the character the show had established. The show also had a tradition of using needle drops, meaning pre-existing songs dropped into scenes for emotional effect, with more care than most television programs. The selection of songs was rarely random. MacFarlane had opinions about music, strong ones, and those opinions showed up in the choices. Big band standards, Broadway show tunes, early rock and roll, and vintage country all appeared in the show at various points, and each choice said something about the moment it was placed in. The Conway Twitty gag deserves its own examination, not as a music Easter egg precisely, but as a musical statement that was hiding a creative argument inside what looked like pure laziness. For those who are unfamiliar, Conway Twitty was a country music singer whose career stretched from the late 1950s through the early 1990s, encompassing dozens of hit singles and a style that was smooth, romantic, and deeply traditional. He died in 1993, and his music became part of the classic country catalog. Family Guy, starting in the sixth season, began inserting what were essentially full music video performances of Conway Twitty songs into episodes in place of traditional cutaway gags. The camera would cut to a performance of a Twitty song, the performance would play through, and then the show would return to its story as if nothing had happened. These were uniformly long. They were uniformly unedited. They contained no joke in the traditional sense. The audience would sit there watching Conway Twitty perform for a minute or more, waiting for a punchline that never arrived. The consensus reading of these segments, and the one the show seemed to encourage through subsequent meta-references, was that they were an expression of creative emptiness, the writers literally playing a song instead of writing a joke. And this reading was not entirely wrong. But there was another reading, subtler and arguably more interesting, which was that the Conway Twitty segments were a comment on the nature of the cutaway gag itself. By replacing a cutaway with something that was recognizably a performance, a structured piece of entertainment with a beginning and an end, the show was making visible the fact that its own cutaways were also performances, also structured pieces of entertainment with beginnings and ends, also somewhat disconnected from the story around them. Conway Twitty, viewed this way, was Family Guy staring into a mirror. The segments made the audience uncomfortable by doing explicitly what the show's cutaway format did implicitly, interrupting the story with something unrelated and then asking the audience to accept the interruption as part of the show. Most people experienced this as filler. Some people experienced it as genuinely avant-garde comedy. MacFarlane, who clearly made the decision to repeat the gag multiple times, seems to have been entertaining both interpretations simultaneously. The musical numbers that appeared in Family Guy episodes were taken as a body of work, some of the most technically accomplished material the show produced. MacFarlane's background as a singer and his love of the Broadway tradition meant that when the show staged a musical number, it tended to be done with real craft. The lyrics were better than they needed to be. The arrangements were better than they needed to be. The performances, recorded by a cast that included MacFarlane's exceptional vocal range, were better than they needed to be. These musical moments were also, frequently, the places where the show's hidden emotional life came closest to the surface. A song could carry feeling that straight dialogue would have made awkward or maudlin. When Peter sang to Lois, or when Brian expressed something through music that he was too guarded to express directly, the musical format provided cover for a degree of sincerity that the show's predominantly ironic mode could not otherwise accommodate. This was its own kind of Easter egg, genuine feeling hidden inside a delivery format that the show also used for pure comedy. You could listen to a song in a Family Guy episode and receive it as a joke, or you could receive it as an expression of something real from the character singing it. Both interpretations were available, and the show never told you which one was correct. Section 9. The meta-jokes when the show talked to itself. Family Guy knew it was a television show. This sounds obvious, but most television shows do not actually act on this knowledge in any sustained or interesting way. Most television shows behave as if they are windows into real worlds populated by people who are unaware of being observed. They maintain the convention of fiction because the convention is what makes fiction work. Family Guy broke this convention regularly, deliberately, and with increasing frequency as the seasons went on. And the way it broke the convention was itself a hidden message, a running commentary on the nature of the show and the relationship between the show and its audience. The fourth wall breaks in the early seasons were rare enough to be genuinely surprising when they happened. A character might glance at the camera. The narrator might acknowledge the show's own premises. Stewie, in particular, was given moments of apparent self-awareness, winking at the audience in ways that suggested he knew more about his own situation than the other characters did. These early moments worked because they were deployed sparingly. Their rarity was part of their impact. When a character acknowledged the camera, it meant something, because it happened so seldom. By the middle and later seasons, the fourth wall had effectively dissolved. Characters commented on their own show with regularity. They referenced their ratings. They mentioned Fox and the network's programming decisions. They brought up the fact that the show had been on too long, or that their character had changed in ways the original writing would not have permitted, or that the cutaway format was being overused. There was a tension in this approach that the show never quite resolved. Acknowledging a problem is not the same as fixing it. A character pointing at the camera and saying, "Yes, we know this show has been on too many seasons," was, in one sense, evidence of self-awareness. In another sense, it was using the appearance of self-awareness as a substitute for the actual work of improvement. The episode Back to the Pilot, from Season 10, is the most complete expression of this tendency, and also the most technically fascinating. In the episode, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the events of the show's very first episode, Death Has a Shadow. They walk through scenes from the pilot, interacting with the 1,999 versions of the characters, and observing the show as it originally existed. The visual conceit is extraordinary. Newer, more polished versions of the characters sharing scenes with their own older, rougher iterations, the animation styles of different eras pressed into the same frame. The episode makes explicit what fans had long argued. The early show and the later show were not quite the same show. The early Peter was different from the later Peter. The early Brian was different from the later Brian. By showing them in the same scenes, the episode was acknowledging the transformation, while also, in a sense, mourning it. But then the episode went further. During a cutaway sequence that was occurring in the original pilot, the camera cuts to the original pilot's version of Peter and his friends, who are seen waiting in the background during a cutaway moment. They have nothing to do. They are just standing there. One of them asks what they are supposed to be doing, and the answer is, waiting for the cutaway to end so the story can resume. This was Family Guy making explicit the structural criticism that South Park had leveled at it in 2006, the one about the characters having nothing to do while the cutaways played. The show was not just acknowledging the criticism, it was turning the criticism into the joke. It was saying, yes, we know this is how it works, and we know some people find it problematic, and we are going to show you exactly what they mean and then continue doing it anyway. Whether you find that admirable or infuriating probably says something about your relationship with the show overall. The Season 10 episode Cutaway Land took this meta-commentary one step further by making the cutaway format itself the subject of the episode's plot. Peter and Lois discover that they can travel physically into the cutaway dimension, moving between the random sketches and unrelated scenarios that the show uses as its comedy infrastructure. They meet the versions of themselves that exist in these brief, disconnected moments, and discover that the cutaway universe operates by its own logic. The episode ends with Peter waking up and discovering the whole thing was a dream. This ending, which is one of the oldest and most exhausted narrative devices in storytelling, was apparently chosen deliberately as yet another layer of self-aware commentary. The show about cutaways ending with the oldest cutaway escape hatch in existence. But here is the detail that makes the episode stranger than it first appears. The cutaways that Peter and Lois traveled through in Cutaway Land were recycled from earlier seasons. The show was not only making the cutaway format the subject of the episode, it was using old cutaways as the raw material, revisiting its own past, building a new story out of components from previous stories. This is either an acknowledgement of creative exhaustion or a sophisticated meditation on the show's relationship with its own history. It is probably both, held in uncomfortable coexistence. The Back to the Multiverse video game, released in 2012, extended the meta-commentary into an entirely different medium. In the game, Brian and Stewie travel through parallel universes that are parodies of other animated shows and cultural properties, meeting alternate versions of themselves and fighting enemies from various franchise realities. The game was, structurally, the same argument the show had always been making, that Family Guy existed in a larger animated universe, adjacent to and in conversation with all the other shows that shared its space in popular culture. The most self-aware of all the show's meta moments may be the Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8, the one where the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and simply talk to each other for the episode's full runtime. This episode had no cutaways, no random gags, no fourth wall breaks, no meta-commentary. It was two characters having extended, real conversations about their lives, their fears, their relationship with each other, and their reasons for continuing to exist. It was, in some ways, the anti-Family Guy, a pure character study from a show that was increasingly known for the opposite of character studies. and in the context of all the meta-commentary surrounding it. In the context of episodes that acknowledge the show's own weaknesses and limitations, the Brian and Stewie Vault episode read as a kind of apology. An apology made not in words but in practice, a demonstration of what the show could do when it stopped showing off and just committed to the work. The episode revealed something that the meta-jokes obscured. The show's self-awareness was not always performed. Sometimes it was real, and when it was real, it produced the kind of television that reminded you why you had cared about these characters in the first place. Section 10. Hidden villain moments and the dark undertones. Family Guy was always darker than it looked. The comedy was brightly lit and energetically paced and frequently absurd enough to feel light. But underneath the bright surface, running like a cold current through the warmth of the central family comedy, there was something considerably less comfortable. The darkness showed up in moments that were easy to laugh past, embedded in jokes or cutaways or background details, and it accumulated over the seasons into a portrait of a universe that was considerably bleaker than its presentation style suggested. The Evil Stewie episode is one of the clearest examples of the show deliberately externalizing its own darkness. In Season 9's The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, Brian tells Stewie that he is going soft, that the dangerous, unpredictable, evil genius of the early seasons has been replaced by a gentler, more emotionally accessible person. Stewie, stung by this, invents a machine that he intends to use to restore his earlier personality, but the machine does not restore anything. Instead, it extracts Stewie's remaining evil traits and deposits them into a separate entity, a clone named Awitz, who contains all the darkness that Stewie has slowly been shedding across the seasons. Awitz is, by every measure, significantly more alarming than Stewie ever was in his evil genius period. He is not strategic or grandiose. He is simply violent and without conscience, a creature of pure malice with no organizing ambition beyond causing harm. The episode was the show acknowledging explicitly that something had changed about Stewie across the years, that the softening had been real and measurable, and that what had been removed in that softening was not just a comedic conceit but something darker and more interesting. By pulling the evil out and making it a separate character, the show was almost diagnosing what Stewie had lost. The fact that Awitz was written as a villain rather than as something more sympathetic suggests the show was not mourning the change. But the episode's very existence as a piece of storytelling said something the show might not have intended to say, that the removal of Stewie's darkness had left him as a less complete person, that the darkness was part of what had made him real. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode returned to this territory in a different register. In that episode, one of Brian's most significant revelations involves a gun he keeps in a safety deposit box. He eventually explains to Stewie that he has considered ending his own life. He has thought about suicide, and the gun is there as an option that he has not yet used but has not been able to remove from his life either. This is extraordinary content for a comedy show, not because comedy cannot address serious topics, but because the show frames this disclosure within a relationship that has been one of the most dependable sources of warmth in the whole series. Brian and Stewie's friendship has been the emotional center of the show since the 4th season at least, and here is Brian, in that friendship's most intimate possible context, confessing to Stewie that he is not doing well, that beneath the wit and the literary pretensions and the martinis, there is genuine pain and a passive relationship with mortality. The episode handles this with more care than Family Guy typically managed in its more sensitive moments. There is no joke at the revelation's expense. There is no cutaway. Stewie's response is tender and serious. He tells Brian he matters. He tells Brian that he, Stewie, would be destroyed if Brian were gone. The scene is then followed by a moment that could have undercut it, in which Stewie asks Brian to eat his diaper, and Brian refuses. And then after a long pause, Brian complies, and the two of them sort of sit there in the shared absurdity of the situation. But even this moment does not feel like a joke at the expense of what preceded it. It feels like relief, like two people who have said something very real and are now retreating together into the familiar comfort of being ridiculous. Herbert, the elderly neighbor who expressed inappropriate interest in Chris, was handled by the show in a way that became increasingly complicated as the seasons went on. In the early seasons, his characterization was straightforward, a dark joke presented in the show's signature style, using Herbert's soft-spoken gentleness as a contrast with the troubling nature of his interest in teenage boys. But as Herbert was used more over the years, something strange happened. He accumulated context. His past was referenced. He had served in the military. He had had experiences that the show treated with something approaching respect, even sympathy. He became a character with a history, and the history made him complicated in ways that the original joke had not accounted for. The show never resolved this complication satisfactorily. It could not, because the resolution would have required the show to make a definitive statement about Herbert that it was not willing to make. So it continued to use him as both a joke and a character, and the tension between those two uses accumulated in silence. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West throughout most of the show's run until West's death in 2017, was another character with a hidden depth that was inconsistently explored. West played a version of himself as the eccentric mayor of the show's setting, a character who made surreal and non-sequitur decisions in every episode he appeared in. The comedy of Adam West the mayor was the comedy of a man who was clearly, deeply not right, who had achieved civic power through processes that remained entirely mysterious, and who exercised that power in ways that suggested a complete disconnect from conventional reality. But West brought his own performance history to the role, and the show used that history in ways that rewarded attention. Adam West's most famous previous role was Batman, the campy television version from 1966, and the show frequently made reference to this, sometimes directly and sometimes through character details that would have made more sense to an audience familiar with West's career. In one notable background detail, West's wardrobe in his office contained not just his mayoral regalia but a Batman costume, which was visible in the background of scenes set in the mayor's office. The show was not formally acknowledging that the mayor was secretly Batman. It was doing something more interesting, keeping the connection alive in background detail while never making it explicit, letting the audience decide how much weight to give it. The costume was just there, real or not, canon or not. A detail that rewarded the people who looked. Section 11. The lore you never noticed. Character backstories and continuity Easter eggs. Family Guy built its world through detail rather than exposition. The major characters were introduced quickly, their basic traits established through action rather than description, and then the show proceeded to build around them with the kind of patience that is more typical of long-form narrative fiction than of animated network comedy. The result was a universe considerably more detailed and internally complex than casual viewing suggested. Behind every main character was a backstory that had been developed in pieces across seasons, sometimes appearing briefly in a throwaway moment in one episode and then returning fully realized much later when the narrative needed it. Peter Griffin's backstory was seated most obviously in his relationship with his father, Francis Griffin, who appeared in several early episodes as a rigidly religious, emotionally withholding man who could not bring himself to express affection for his son. These episodes were played partly for comedy and partly for something that functioned as genuine pathos, glimpses of a childhood that had taught Peter to want love in ways he had never been given the tools to seek it properly. Francis's death in a later episode, which the show treated with unusual seriousness, marked a significant moment in Peter's characterization. The grief was handled with more care than most of the show's emotional moments, and it was followed by episodes that explored Peter's relationship with paternal expectation and his own sense of failure in ways that connected back to the early Francis storylines. But there was also something hidden in Peter's biography that the show never explicitly stated: the suggestion that Peter's particular brand of casual cruelty, his tendency to hurt people without apparent awareness that he was doing so, was itself inherited. Francis had been cruel in ways that he would not have recognized as cruelty, because his frame of reference for acceptable behavior had been built in an environment of similar cruelty. Peter was repeating patterns that had been laid down long before he had any opportunity to notice them or resist them. The season 14 episode Peter's Sister made this explicit when it introduced Karen, Peter's sister who had been a bully and an abuser in their shared childhood. The episode depicted Peter's own abuse at Karen's hands and connected it directly to the cycle of cruelty in the Griffin household. This was the show revealing a piece of backstory that recontextualized essentially everything Peter had done in the preceding 13 seasons. It was hidden not in a background detail or a freeze-frame moment, but in the show's own history, waiting for the writers to find the episode that would illuminate it. Lois Griffin's backstory contained its own buried complexity. She was introduced as the rational anchor of the Griffin family, the one who kept things from collapsing entirely, the patient wife and mother who loved a difficult man and difficult children with a tenacity that the show treated as its own kind of heroism. But Lois had a past that surfaced in pieces across the seasons, and that suggested she was less straightforwardly virtuous than her role required her to be. There were references to a wild youth, to choices made before Peter that she had not entirely processed. There was a complicated relationship with her wealthy parents, the Pewterschmidts, which revealed that Lois had grown up in an environment of immense privilege that she had rejected in some ways while remaining shaped by it in others. The show dropped these details into individual episodes without building a comprehensive narrative around them, which meant that each revelation felt like a surprise even when it was consistent with what had been established before. Lois's history was available to be assembled by attentive viewers across many seasons of watching, but it was never handed to them in any organized way. The same was true of Quagmire, who was one of the show's most carefully constructed characters despite his surface presentation as a simple comedy machine. In his early appearances, Quagmire was essentially a walking punchline, a man whose entire personality consisted of an aggressive and indiscriminate interest in women. The joke was the concentration, the way he had apparently eliminated every other aspect of personality in service of this single consuming preoccupation. But across the seasons, the show built around this surface a character with genuine emotional depth. The military backstory, mentioned in occasional episodes, suggested that Quagmire had a life before his current incarnation, experiences that had shaped him in ways the show only partially explored. The episodes that gave him romantic relationships that were not purely comedic showed a person capable of real feeling who had, for reasons that the show gestured toward without fully explaining, decided to organize his life around avoiding the vulnerability that genuine feeling required. The Quagmire and Brian dynamic, which became one of the show's more extensively discussed storylines in the later seasons, was in some sense the most direct articulation of this hidden depth. The speech that Quagmire delivered in Jerome is the New Black, in which he enumerated every way in which he found Brian insufferable, was more than a comedy moment. It was the expression of something that had been building since their first interactions, a genuine and considered critique from a person who had watched Brian perform his self-image for years and was tired of the performance. The fact that Quagmire, of all people, was the character who delivered the most coherent and specific criticism of Brian was the hidden joke inside the speech. This was a man whose behavior was objectively far more problematic than Brian's by any conventional measure. But Quagmire's honesty about himself, his lack of pretension about what he was and what he wanted, made him a more reliable narrator than Brian's carefully maintained image of intellectual seriousness allowed Brian to be. The Evil Monkey's backstory, revealed in Hannah Banana, worked as both a standalone character episode and as a callback to one of the show's most persistent running gags. For 7 seasons, viewers had seen Chris react with terror to something lurking in his closet, something that pointed at him with theatrical menace and then vanished. The joke was the pointing, the exaggerated horror movie framing, the inexplicability of why there was a monkey in a child's bedroom. When the backstory was revealed, the pointing was recontextualized immediately. The monkey was not threatening Chris. He was expressing something that he had no other language for. The gesture that had been the visual shorthand for malevolent intent turned out to be a gesture of frustrated grief. The most dramatic thing a creature could do with its hands when it was hurting in a way that could not be otherwise expressed. This is the kind of hidden storytelling that Family Guy did better than almost any other animated comedy of its era. The surprise was not in the revelation itself, though the revelation was well executed. The surprise was in discovering that something you had interpreted as pure comedy for years had been carrying a story alongside the joke, waiting for the moment when the story could emerge. Section 12. Legacy Easter Eggs, and what the writers left behind for true fans. Everything we have discussed tonight, from the red rum blocks in Stewie's nursery to the Bush Cheney bumper sticker on an Imperial Star Destroyer, from the Conway Twitty segments to Brian's confession in the bank vault, was part of a continuous creative project that the show's writers undertook across more than 2 decades. The project was this: to build a show with 2 distinct registers, 2 modes of existence running simultaneously, so that the casual viewer and the devoted viewer were watching the same episodes but receiving different things from them. The casual viewer received a funny and occasionally brilliant animated comedy with memorable characters, quotable jokes, and cutaway gags that circulated endlessly on the internet. This was a genuine gift. The show built a cultural presence through these elements that was real and lasting. The devoted viewer received all of that and also something else, a secondary text built from background details, freeze-frame rewards, hidden messages, continuity Easter eggs, and moments of self-awareness that rewarded the investment of deep attention. This secondary text was not more important than the primary one, but it was considerably richer, and it is the text that rewards the kind of slow, attentive viewing that A Sleepless Night lends itself to. What makes this secondary text particularly moving, when you think about it over the long arc of the show's history, is that it represented the writer's relationship with the most devoted members of their audience. The people who paused on TV guide covers were the people who cared most about the show. The people who read the shelves of Brian's library were the people who had watched every episode. The people who caught the Roger cameo in the Mos Eisley Cantina were the people who had paid close enough attention to both Family Guy and American Dad to know what they were seeing. The hidden messages were a conversation with these viewers specifically. They were a way of saying, "We know you are there. We see you watching carefully. We put things here for you. Thank you for looking." The show's early seasons were the most generous with this kind of material, in keeping with MacFarlane's intense personal involvement in every aspect of the production. The TV guide moment, the Red Rum blocks, the Gumball 2 Gumball reference, all of these came from a period when the creative team was working at maximum engagement, when every detail felt important, when the show was new enough that the writers were still excited about building its world. As the show aged and the production became more industrialized, the hidden details continued but changed in character. They became more explicitly meta, more focused on the show's relationship with its own history, more interested in commenting on what the show had become than in adding to what the show was. The Season 10 Back to the Pilot episode was the clearest expression of this shift. It was a show looking backward at itself, evaluating its own journey, and finding in that backward look both pride and something like grief. The version of Peter and Brian in the pilot was not better or worse than the version in the 10th season, but they were recognizably different in ways that the episode made visible and somewhat painful. The Quagmire speech about Brian, which aired in Season 8, was in retrospect both a piece of character comedy and a piece of institutional self-criticism. The writers knew what Brian had become. They put that knowledge in Quagmire's mouth. And then they continued doing what they had been doing, which is its own kind of honesty, a refusal to pretend that self-awareness automatically produces change. In the final seasons, the hidden messages became harder to find and more dispersed. The show's energy was going elsewhere, into the broader comedic set pieces and the musical numbers and the occasional emotionally ambitious episode that reminded longtime viewers what the show had once been capable of. But they were still there, for the people who knew where to look. One of the most moving is not a specific hidden message, but a hidden continuity of feeling. Across the show's entire run, in scenes between Brian and Stewie, in the tiny moments of genuine affection that broke through the comedy, in the Vault episode and the Christmas episodes and the Road 2 episodes, there was a consistent emotional current that represented something the writers apparently cared about deeply. The idea that friendship was possible between very different people, that the gulf of difference could be bridged by the act of choosing to stay. Brian was a dog who wanted to be something more. Stewie was a person who had decided that being something more meant not being himself. Their friendship was based on the mutual recognition of this shared problem, a recognition that neither of them could articulate in the show's normal mode, but that the special episodes periodically made visible. This was the Easter egg hidden beneath all the other Easter eggs. Beneath the freeze-frame jokes and the background text, and the Star Wars references and the crossed-universe cameos, there was a story about two people who were difficult to love and who loved each other anyway. And the writers put it there in the same way they put everything else they valued in the show, carefully, with affection, in places where only the people paying very close attention would find it. The show ran for more than 2 decades. It made more than 400 episodes. It changed enormously from its first season to its latest, in ways that were sometimes improvements and sometimes losses. But the hidden creative intelligence that built those first 3 seasons, the attention to detail, the willingness to hide things for the devoted viewer, the understanding that a show could speak in 2 registers at once, never entirely left. It just got quieter. And quietly, across all those seasons, across all those episodes, the writers kept leaving messages for the people who were watching carefully enough to find them. You have always been those people. That is why you are still here. Afterward, the gift of looking closely. There is a particular kind of pleasure in finding something that was always there. Not something new, Not something the creators added in response to your attention, but something that was always in the frame, waiting, patient, that you simply had not been moving slowly enough to see. Family Guy gave its most devoted viewers this pleasure again and again across 25 years of episodes. It built a show with visible rooms and secret rooms, and it never stopped filling the secret rooms even as the visible show changed in ways that its creators sometimes celebrated and sometimes regretted. The red drum blocks in Stewie's nursery, the Luke Perry TV guide with its impossible message, the Bush, Cheney bumper sticker on a Star Destroyer that only existed for a single second in a single frame, the evil monkey's pointing hand that carried a broken heart behind it, Brian's confession in the vault, Quagmire at the cantina surrounded by the disreputable residents of other fictional universes. All of these are things you now know were there, waiting for you, since the episode they appeared in first aired. There are more. There are always more. Family Guy, at its best and even at its worst, was a show that believed in the value of looking closely, of slowing down, of rewarding the person who was willing to be the second audience, the one with their finger on the pause button and their eyes on the corners of the frame. That is the kind of viewer you have always been. And it was always worth it. If you enjoyed this journey through everything the show was hiding, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more people find their way here, and this kind of slow, careful examination of the things we love is exactly what this space is built for. More is coming. Sleep well.